Hello, Internet. It's time for another Wednesday's Serial. So, what I wanted to talk about today was a chunk of Superman that I just went through. And it was interesting, and I just kind of wanted to talk about it a bit. Because I spent some time with it, and that's what we do here. The Just to give you a sense, I'm not going to spend forever, but this is what I'm talking about. So, there's this run of trades that collects the early 2000s on Superman, and it did something really interesting, I think, in that time for the character. Also, more importantly, these collections were running across when they had like Superman, Adventures of Superman, Man of Steel, Action Comics, and the story was all kind of one thing, which was a terrible way to do comics, in my opinion. But when you collect it, it's fun. It works in a way. So, but there's still a lot of jagged edges because of that. You get a ton of creators trying to tell these things. In a weird way, it's kind of like what they're trying to do with the weekly comics, but maybe a little more haphazard. So, the first trade, No Limits, establishes our new status quo in a way. It's not like a hard thing, but Superman is kind of the Superman you imagine. He's very much the classic Superman. Powers, Lex Luthor's there, Lois Lane's there, Perry White's there. He's dealing with all that, and he's trying to learn how to fight better. So Mogul comes and trains him to fight this Imperious Rex guy, and some people are gunning for him, and it's nothing huge, but it just works really well, and it plays with the idea of this character not necessarily being able to overcome something without working for it. So I enjoyed that. Next up is Endgame, which is the volume 2 of this, and this brings in Brainiac. It brings in this B13 virus that affects like the city of Metropolis. And what's really interesting about that is that just plays everything forward later, making Metropolis the city of tomorrow with all this new tech after things are resolved. But we get this interesting take on Brainiac and Luthor. Luthor has a daughter in here, and then she dies as accounts of what happens within. But how Luthor is dealing with Brainiac is as important as that Superman's doing with it, in a way that makes it more interesting, because Luthor becomes a player in the Superman universe and less of the enemy of the weak. And so we contend with him the same way we contend with Jimmy Olsen or Perry White. Obviously different tone, but he's just a character instead of one of the villains in that way. And that's really what kind of sold me on this chunk, and that made that work. Which really led us into Death Do Us Part, where Superman is starting to have marital troubles with Lois Lane, and she starts phasing him out. She starts giving him crap. Meanwhile, Superman's getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And eventually, what happens is Lois says she's going to leave him. And so we're left with that. And that goes right into this next chunk, Critical Condition, where a whole bunch of Superman mythos characters, Supergirl, Superboy, Steel, go into Superman's body. They get miniaturized by the Atom, and they have to save him. But they're dealing with that, and then eventually Superman, right before all that, in order to find out what happened with Lois Lane, contacts Batman, because it becomes a murder mystery case when they find out the Parasite has been impersonating Lois Lane the entire time, which is brings up some questions that we're not necessarily supposed to ask, but who knows necessarily how long she's been that way. But it makes it another wrinkle, and all this kind of happens at once, and that's really interesting. And so that chunk of what I read was really rewarding and interesting, and really great Superman comics, because it took this character, Superman, the normal Superman problem, did away with that problem just by writing good, interesting stories. I mean, Superman could have died from being sick, we know he's not, but the fact that he is sick and being poisoned by this whatever is interesting, and the fact that it's a Brainiac thing and they have to go and fight it is comic book fun, but there you go. Alright. Then we get kind of a separated event that takes place in all this, but it gave me good reason to reread Emperor Joker, which takes place between the last trade and the next trade I want to show, where Superman has to deal with the Joker having godlike abilities, and it was Ms. Blixblick that accidentally gave the Joker the abilities, and how did they deal with that? And they deal with the idea of Batman in the Joker's mind in just a fascinating way. And that's kind of the heart of this. But before they get down to the nitty-gritty, they kind of just have fun with their event, and they show this world that's just topsy-turvy, where Superman's a criminal, and then he has to get Steel. They're doing all this, and it's all these ideas that would come from the Joker, but with a Superman comic on a Superman level, which is really great, and then they bring in Batman. What was funny, too, is they had brought Joker to mix with Luthor in an earlier chunk of what I had read, and that was really engaging. Plus they had Harley versus Mercy, and they had these little like cat fight pages that were totally goofy and over the top, and just good fun stuff. I don't know, like, this Emperor Joker gets dark at times, but this is one of the most, you can tell the writers and artists were just having fun with playing with crazy concepts and seeing what they could do with this idea. Like, this is what an event comic should be. They have the event, and then it's resolved. And there you go. But this was across so many comics, and, man, if you haven't, Emperor Joker kind of stands on its own. Just know you're starting off kind of bam in the middle of something, but that's what it is. And then it ends where it ends. So it's collected, but it's wacky. Then so much of this run paid off in President Luthor. So this starts off with, will Luthor make it to presidency? Which right now maybe resonates a little better than it should. And I thought this was so fascinating. Then you have Superman dealing with this idea that the American public couldn't possibly, vote this guy in, but then they do, and then he just kind of has to deal with it. But it wraps in on some stuff that was set up earlier. So Luthor isn't just, the big bad guy of Metropolis. For a while, he owned the Daily Planet. And so he sold it back to Perry, but there were some stipulations, and he kind of lords it over them every now and again, but he kind of separates that when he's running for president, because he can't have the press and the politics sort of deal, but there's a few lingering ties there. But the biggest one is there is this deal that Lois Lane struck with Lex Luthor in order for this to happen, where she's willing to bury one story when he requests it. And you see this come in, and it really makes for this interesting bit. But also, while Superman's dealing with all these different problems, Luthor's able to give him crap on a different level and rein in as chief and staff. And it is run, Luthor finds one of Clark's old friends from Smallville, who had become a governor and all that, and then makes him vice president, and that becomes even more problematic, because apparently before all this, Luthor had kidnapped that guy's wife. It's one of his weirdo plots, and you just kind of have to deal with it, and it just becomes all these weird machinations of the ideas circling in on themselves, and so we just have to see how that all plays together. So they set up all these little things, and they just kind of pull one string, and they all just come together to make this story, and then the story just kind of you know what they have to tell next, but where they're going to go, you're not necessarily sure. And I just thought that's one of the best things you can do with something like this. And this was just, after reading the rest of it, so rewarding. And then we come to the big boy, Our World's at War. And this is supposed to be the idea of Superman actually going to war on the scale that would impact Superman. So this starts off with this, surface to, or air to surface bombing of Kansas, in which we don't know if his parents necessarily make it out or not. We assume not from the way this all is and ends. But things keep escalating. There's a return of this Imperious Rex, who Mongol initially taught Superman how to beat up when the Saran began. It plays in with the B-32, so we go from Imperious Rex to dealing with Brainiac, but then Darkseid becomes a component, and instead of just Superman dealing with it, by the end of this comic we're dealing with more Wonder Woman than we are Superman, in a very weird way, but not even Wonder Woman as much as Hippolyta, which at this time was the Wonder Woman of the JSA, which was this whole deal. And then we also deal with the Young Justice team, who gets wrapped up in a lot of this at the behest of Luthor putting them in where they shouldn't have been necessarily. And there becomes all this weird backroom dealing, and by the end of it, the idea of this being a Superman comic is just kind of out the door. Like, Superman's a player for sure, but in a weird way, this almost has more to do with Wonder Woman than it does Superman. And it jars between events of where they're going, because one comic will have something in the middle of it, and then you'll finish that comic, then you'll come back, then it's a big deal, and that's what they're dealing with for the rest of the next issue. So this collection's kind of haphazard in that sense, but that's how event comics are. Also, it's easy to get lost where we are in the action because things are in such big scale. So by the time we get to the real chunk of the action, you have Earth, and nothing's happening there except for when Luthor is talking to people over some screen. And then we have War World, and then the Battle Planet. And Battle Planet's Imperious Rex, War World's Darkseid. There's all this junk going on. There's a little conflict like in between the spaces, and it's supposed to be so huge. But on the other hand, if they're on War World or Battle Planet, they're just kind of there. They're supposed to be entire planets the size of the moon, so maybe not as big as Earth, but I mean, like, they're just kind of in one or the other, and then it's like it could have been like a state size, and so it just doesn't, that scale doesn't happen as much, but it's easy to get lost with all the explosions and shooting. So Our World's at War is definitely a continuation, plays off of a lot of the stuff set up in the earlier Superman stuff that I read so far. But it doesn't quite wrap everything up either, and there's technically one trade left in the collection, and I can't seem to find it super affordably, so I'll be on the lookout for it. But overall, accepting this chunk, it was a super enjoyable run. It really shows what you can do with Superman, and had a lot of the creators that really played with what you can do. Loeb, Casey, Kelly, a lot of interesting creators playing around in the artistic styles were kind of all over the map while reading this, which was kind of fun to see how different people are dealing with it. And this is at the height of DC's craziness, where you have all these different characters that can come in at any time. I mean, there was the Metal Men, there was, like I said, Young Justice, Flash, Wonder Woman, the JSA, JLA, just a whole slew of crazy things, and you just kind of roll with the punches and go with it because it was comics. Not everything had to be set up to a T, not everything had to take 6 issues, but they just kept running. And this was years worth of comics, so it was just an interesting diversion. Thought I'd share some thoughts, and yeah, so catch y'all sometime. I'm gonna be gone for 3 weeks, so I'll get back to it when I get back to it.